In the heart of a brutal Lancaster winter, Samuel Miller's barn was buried beneath drifts of snow. Yet, hidden within its walls, a secret room kept his family warm when all hope seemed lost. How did he build it, and what drove him to prepare for a storm no one could foresee? Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of simple living and quiet faith resonate with you, join us tomorrow for another tale of survival and devotion. Samuel Miller's hands ached as he pulled his woolen coat tighter against the biting wind, watching the snowflakes swirl in the growing storm. He had been awake for hours, each creak of the barn's timbers echoing in the stillness of the early morning. The wind was picking up, and he could already see the way the snow was thickening, drifting in waves against the walls of his farm. It had been a year of fierce winters. The colder months had come early, and the cold seemed to hold on longer each time. Samuel wasn't new to winter hardships. His father had taught him to keep wood stacked high, to build for the worst. But as he looked across the snow-covered fields and the faint outline of his barn, Samuel's mind wandered to what had been a secret for the past few winters, the hidden room in the back corner of the barn, behind the thick stack of straw bales. The room was more than just a retreat. It was a refuge, a shelter when the world outside was a wall of white, with no promise of warmth. Samuel had built it in silence, with his own hands. He had hidden it from the prying eyes of the neighbors, who would have mocked him for such an unnecessary luxury. "What use is a room when you have a barn?" they'd say, their voices dripping with that special brand of frontier skepticism. But Samuel knew better. He had grown up on these hills, and he had seen what winter could do to those who were unprepared. He knew the warning signs. The first blizzard had swept through weeks ago, far earlier than the weather reports had predicted. The wind was howling now, scraping against the barn walls, pushing snow into every crack. Samuel couldn't ignore it any longer. This storm, the one that had been talked about for days in hushed whispers, was the real one. The snow was too deep, the cold too brutal. Even the strongest barns would buckle beneath the weight of this season's fury. As he knelt beside the barn door, Samuel could almost hear the wind speaking to him, urging him to trust the secret room. It was his silent promise to his family, his quiet way of saying, "When the cold turns cruel, there will always be a way to survive." The day Samuel Miller began planning the hidden room, he had no idea how it would become his family's lifeline. It was a simple idea, born out of necessity. A small, insulated room in the back corner of the barn, one that could hold his family during the fiercest of winters. He had seen neighbors lose their livestock to cold, watched as even the sturdiest barn structures bowed under snowdrifts. Samuel's mind had always worked with an understanding of the land that few others possessed. His father, a man of quiet humility, had taught him the importance of preparation, of working with the seasons, not against them. So, when the first whispers of a harsh winter reached him in the early fall, Samuel didn't wait for the snow to begin falling. He began building. The space was small, barely large enough to hold his wife, 2 children, and the few necessities they could carry. But it was more than just size that made the room special. It was the materials. Samuel took the time to gather thick, seasoned timber, not the smaller pieces he used for the barn's framing. These were logs dense with life, with warmth. He knew they would hold against the cold. In the dead of night, when the wind outside howled with an icy fury, Samuel would work by lantern light. His hands, skilled but weathered, would fit each beam into place, ensuring the walls were tight. No draft would be allowed to enter this small refuge. His neighbors had laughed at him when they first saw him hauling straw bales into the barn's rear corner, thinking he was preparing a storage space. But Samuel was thinking ahead. The straw would be the final barrier against the cold. Layer upon layer of insulation, with the thick timber framing, would create an airtight seal. The inside would stay warm, while the snow piled higher outside. Each piece was chosen with care. Samuel had spent days learning about the properties of straw, about how it would trap heat and hold it, even when the temperature outside dipped below freezing. He lined the walls, sealing the cracks with a mixture of clay and sand, something his father had taught him when they'd worked together to build the barn so many years ago. The floor, he decided, would be made of rough-hewn boards, thick and solid, offering stability beneath their feet when the winds began to wail. This room was a secret, but not one that was born of fear. It was the result of quiet faith, in the belief that preparation could conquer even the harshest winter. It was Samuel's act of devotion to his family, a promise that when the cold turned its cruelest, they would have shelter, warmth, and one another. By the time the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, Samuel had finished the room. It was more than just a physical space. It was a sanctuary of the heart, a testament to his belief in doing things right, even when others doubted. The hidden room wasn't just a refuge from the storm outside, it was a symbol of the deep-rooted faith in the land, in the craftsmanship, and in the quiet strength that had carried Samuel through every winter before. By mid-December, the storm had arrived not with the promise of winter's usual chill, but with the unrelenting fury of a blizzard unlike any Samuel had seen before. The wind screamed across the barren fields, carrying with it an endless sheet of snow that buried every familiar landmark. As the storm intensified, Samuel knew the barn would soon be buried in drifts. His family had settled into their routines, preparing for the long nights ahead, but now the urgency was palpable. Inside, the barn was alive with quiet activity. Samuel's wife Ruth stirred the large pot of stew over the fire, the warmth of the hearth filling the room. The children had bundled up, sitting close to one another by the fire, their faces flushed with the warmth of the flames. Yet there was a weight in the air, a silence that hung over them all, a knowing of what was to come. The winds outside roared like a living thing, pushing against the walls of the barn, its force growing with every passing hour. Samuel stood by the door, gazing out at the swirling storm. His heart tightened. The barn, sturdy and built with his own hands, stood strong, but how long would it last? The snow was falling fast, each flake thick and wet, forming a barrier between the outside world and the shelter he'd created. Within hours, the barn would be lost beneath a blanket of white. The very land they lived on would become invisible, swallowed by the storm. As Ruth finished setting the firewood for the night, Samuel moved toward the back of the barn, his boots crunching against the straw-covered floor. He walked past the pile of hay and the small wooden stall where his horses were usually kept, heading straight to the hidden room. There, behind the hay bales and the carefully placed straw, was the small, insulated room he had built with such care. No one in the village knew it was there. It had been his secret, his plan to protect his family when the world turned against them. He opened the door quietly, taking one last glance at the barn before stepping inside. The warmth immediately wrapped around him, a quiet comfort in contrast to the raging storm outside. It was as he had hoped. The thick walls of timber, the layers of straw, and the tightly packed clay had created an airtight seal. The room, though small, felt like an embrace. "Ruth, children," Samuel called softly. "It's time." Ruth looked up from her stew, and the children rose from their seats, their faces lit with the knowledge that the time had come to retreat to their refuge. They gathered their things in silence, the seriousness of the moment settling on them like a blanket. They didn't need words. They knew what the storm meant. The door shut behind them with a quiet thud, and the family huddled together in the warmth of the room. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, giving thanks for the work that had brought them here. As the storm howled louder outside, he sat beside Ruth, his hand resting gently on hers, and his children gathered around him. In the hidden room, surrounded by the shelter he had built, they were safe for now. Days turned to weeks as the storm continued, unrelenting in its fury. The snow piled higher, draping the barn in an untouched blanket of white, as the cold crept into every crack of the world outside. In the hidden room, the Millers settled into a rhythm. The barn was silent, but they could feel the storm pressing down, its weight constant and suffocating. Yet inside the warm room, they found comfort in the small things, the simple rituals of daily life that tethered them to each other and to the land they had chosen. Samuel's heart swelled with a quiet pride every time he saw Ruth prepare the hearth, or when his children played games on the rough wooden floor, their laughter a sweet sound amidst the storm's howls. They had enough food, thanks to the careful preparations Samuel had made in the fall. He had known that this winter would be one to test them all, and so he had prepared not just for their survival, but for their endurance. There was work to do, even in the hidden room. Samuel checked the woodpile regularly, making sure they wouldn't run out. The fire was their lifeline. its steady warmth a comfort amidst the silence of the storm. Ruth kept the room tidy, her hands moving with quiet efficiency as she cared for the children and for Samuel. Each day, she added a bit of warmth to the fire, the flickering light dancing on the walls and creating long shadows in the room. The days blurred together, one after the other, as the wind continued to howl outside. Samuel often found himself staring at the thick walls of the room, his thoughts drifting back to the world beyond. How had the neighbors fared? Had anyone else prepared for such a storm? His thoughts would always return to the quiet peace within the room. Here, they were untouched by the storm. Here, the world could wait. But Samuel knew that this peace was fragile. He knew the storm would end, but when? And what would they find when it did? How much of the land had been lost to the blizzards, and what would they face once the snow began to melt? The wind was still relentless. Each day brought new challenges. There were no visits from neighbors, no news of the outside world. Samuel felt the weight of isolation settle deeper with each passing day. Yet, through it all, his faith held steady. His family was safe. His preparation had kept them warm when others may have faltered. As they sat together by the fire on the longest night of the storm, Samuel held Ruth's hand, his heart at peace. They were surviving, and they would continue to survive because they had faith in each other and in the simple, humble strength of the shelter they had built together. The storm had finally broken. Weeks of relentless snow and wind had given way to the faintest hint of sunlight as it pierced through the thick clouds for the first time. Samuel Miller stood by the small window in the hidden room, staring out at the white wilderness that stretched beyond their shelter. The snow had settled, and the fierce winds had died down, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the room, the family stirred, their eyes adjusting to the new, softer light. Ruth moved quietly to the hearth, tending to the low fire, her hands familiar with the motions even in the early morning. The children, who had grown restless in their small sanctuary, sat by the door, gazing out at the snow-covered barn that was slowly being revealed as the drifts began to settle. Samuel watched them, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He knew this was only the beginning of their return to normalcy. The land outside had been transformed, but they had survived. The barn, though buried beneath a thick blanket of snow, still stood a testament to the care he had put into it, both inside and out. And the hidden room, their refuge, had held steady through it all, keeping his family safe and warm when everything else had been covered by the storm. Ruth turned to him, her eyes soft with relief. "Do you think the roads are passable yet?" she asked, her voice low. Samuel shook his head, his brow furrowing. "Not yet, the snow's too deep. But I'll go out soon, check on the barn. We'll know when the roads are clear enough for visitors or the delivery wagons." "I suppose we'll be here for a while yet," Ruth said with a smile, trying to hide the exhaustion in her eyes. "At least we have enough food for a few more weeks." Samuel nodded. He had planned well, but still the weight of their isolation seemed to settle upon him now that the storm was over. The days inside the hidden room had felt both timeless and endless. They had passed with the steady comfort of family, of hearth, of faith, but the silence of the storm had made them realize just how fragile the world outside had become. With the storm gone, he knew that now was the time to check on the state of the land. Their survival was assured for the moment, but the world was far from certain. As Samuel stepped outside, his boots crunching into the newly packed snow, he felt the full weight of the world pressing against him. The storm had changed everything. The barn, once a sturdy structure, was nearly buried under snowdrifts taller than the walls themselves, but the room had held, and so had his family. They had endured. He walked toward the barn, his breath visible in the cold air. He could feel the land, heavy with the weight of winter, beginning to stir as it shifted under the thaw. The sun peeked shyly over the distant hills, casting a pale glow over the frozen landscape. Samuel knew that the thaw would come slowly, but it would come. And with it would come life again, new hope, new possibilities, and new work to be done. The snow that had buried Samuel's barn had begun to recede, slowly but surely, as the first rays of spring sunlight kissed the earth. With it came a quiet sense of renewal. The storm had tested them all, but it had also shown them the strength of their family, the resilience of their work, and the security that could be found in simple preparation. As the days lengthened and the temperature rose, Samuel found himself clearing the last of the snow around the barn, exposing its sturdy frame. His thoughts turned to the work ahead, the repairs, the rebuilding, and the return of life to the land that had been stilled under the winter's grip. The barn stood strong, though it had taken a beating. The roof had held, the walls had endured, but there was work to be done. Snow had piled high along the edges, pushing at the foundation and causing some of the smaller wooden beams to shift. But the hidden room, the small sanctuary that had protected them, was untouched proof of Samuel's careful planning, of the faith he had in what he had built. Samuel worked quickly, knowing that the thaw would bring a new set of challenges. Ruth had already started preparing the garden beds, clearing away the remnants of frost and setting the soil for spring planting. The children were eager to help, their energy renewed by the warmth of the sun. For Samuel, it was a reminder that they had lived through the worst. Now, the work of renewal could begin. As he walked through the barn, inspecting the damage, Samuel felt a deep sense of gratitude for the room he had created, for the strength of his family, and for the faith that had carried them through the darkest days of winter. He had built that hidden room out of necessity, out of a desire to protect those he loved, but in the end, it had become something much more. It had become a symbol of what could be achieved when preparation met perseverance. By mid-April, the barn was fully restored. The snow had melted, and new grass began to sprout in the fields. The land, though scarred by the harsh winter, was slowly coming back to life. The trees budded with the promise of fruit, the sky grew clearer, and the air, once filled with the bite of snow, now carried the scent of renewal. As he stood outside the barn one evening, watching the sun dip low behind the hills, Samuel realized how much had changed in the few months since the storm. They had not just survived, they had endured, they had thrived. The hidden room had been their shelter, but it had also been their lesson. It had shown them that with patience, with faith, and with quiet, steady work, there was nothing they couldn't endure. And as the wind began to shift and the first blossoms of spring filled the air, Samuel Miller knew that the true work of the land was just beginning. The storm had come and gone, but the strength of his family, the bond they shared, would last far beyond the seasons. The future was uncertain, but with faith in their hands and the warmth of the barn to shelter them, they would face whatever came next, together. As the final remnants of winter's grip receded from the land, Samuel Miller found himself alone in the barn one bright morning, the scent of fresh hay and earth filling the air. The barn had been restored, the secret room still as sturdy as the day he built it. Spring had come, but the memories of the winter storms still lingered, like shadows on the land. The work of renewal continued, but Samuel's mind often drifted back to the long nights spent huddled together in that quiet refuge. One early afternoon, as Samuel worked to repair the garden fence, he noticed a figure walking toward his land. At first he thought it was one of the local children, perhaps coming to see if the roads were clear, but as the figure came closer, he recognized the familiar gait of an old neighbor, William Crawford. Crawford, who had once mocked Samuel for his excessive winter preparations, now approached with a slow, deliberate stride. The once confident swagger was gone. Samuel paused in his work, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, unsure of what to expect. "Afternoon, Samuel," Crawford called, his voice soft, not the usual boisterous greeting Samuel was used to. There was a humility in his tone that took Samuel by surprise. "Afternoon, William," Samuel replied, keeping his stance steady, his eyes studying the man who had once doubted him so openly. Crawford came closer, shifting uneasily on his feet. "I was wondering if I could speak with you for a moment," he said, hesitating. Samuel, sensing that this was no ordinary visit, nodded and gestured toward the barn. "Come inside," Samuel said, leading the way toward the familiar doors of the barn, the same doors that had kept his family safe during the worst winter anyone could remember. As they entered, Crawford's eyes darted around, taking in the sight of the barn, the walls that had withstood the storm, and the very place where Samuel had carefully built the secret room. Once inside, they paused by the entrance to the hidden room, the one Samuel had designed as a safe haven during the storm. It was just as he had left it, warm, cozy, and untouched by the passage of time. "I can't say I ever thought I'd be standing here," Crawford began, his voice lower now. "After what we went through. Well, I was wrong, Samuel. Wrong about you. Wrong about how you prepared. I came here because I wanted to learn." He hesitated again, a silent acknowledgement hanging between them. "I lost my wife to the cold this winter, and if it hadn't been for your cabin, well, I might not be standing here at all." Samuel remained silent, listening carefully. He had known that the winter had taken a heavy toll on the neighbors, but hearing it from Crawford himself, in this moment of vulnerability, brought a fresh sense of gravity to the price they had all paid. "How did you know?" Crawford asked, his eyes turning to Samuel. "How did you know it would be this bad?" Samuel took a deep breath, his mind drifting to the years of hard work that had brought him to this point. "I didn't know exactly, but I'd seen winters before. And sometimes you just have to trust what the land tells you. Trust what you know in your heart." Crawford nodded slowly, his hands still and his shoulders heavy with a new understanding. "I've seen the damage. The others in town, they've seen it too. Many lost everything. But your family, your cabin, it stood. You didn't just survive, Samuel. You made sure your family thrived." Samuel looked at his neighbor, now standing in the very room he had built with care. "It wasn't just the cabin. It was the faith to build it right." Crawford nodded once more, finally meeting Samuel's eyes. "I came to ask you to teach me, to help me build better, like you did. I've seen the difference. And I want to do right by my family. I want to do right by my wife." Samuel stood at the edge of the barn the next morning, watching as the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light across the land. The seasons had changed, and with them, everything had begun to shift. Spring was truly here now, filling the earth with warmth and promise. The flowers were beginning to bloom, the trees stretching out their buds, and the faintest hum of life returned to the fields. The barn, now fully restored, had become more than just a shelter. It had become a symbol of endurance, a place where the Miller family had weathered the worst winter they had ever seen. But it was also a place of new beginnings. Samuel had been careful with every choice, every piece of timber, every nail. And now it stood as a testament to the strength that could be found in quiet preparation and simple faith. William Crawford had stayed the night at the Miller farm, and the next morning they were already hard at work. Samuel had invited him to spend the day helping with repairs around the farm, but it wasn't just the physical labor that would occupy their time. No, the real work had begun the night before when Samuel had agreed to teach Crawford how to build a better cabin. A cabin that would stand against the fierce winds of winter and the dangers of the unknown. They spent the day working side by side. Samuel explained how he had chosen the land, how he had selected the strongest timber, how he had ensured that the foundation was solid and secure. He spoke of the details others might overlook, the importance of tight chinking, the careful preparation of the soil beneath the structure, and the need for more than just simple shelter. As they worked together, Samuel felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just the physical act of rebuilding, it was the act of passing on the knowledge that had sustained him. It was the way that their shared labor brought them closer together, not just as neighbors, but as men who understood the quiet power of faith and preparation. Samuel could see the shift in Crawford. The man who had once been quick to judge now listened with reverence, following each of Samuel's instructions with care and attention. By the end of the day, the foundation of the new cabin was set. It was a beginning, a new chapter for both men, and for the community that had been forever changed by the brutal winter. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden hue across the land, Samuel stood beside Crawford, his heart filled with hope. The storm had passed, but the lessons learned during those harsh months would stay with them forever. "Thank you, Samuel," Crawford said quietly, his hands resting on the cabin frame. "This is a new beginning for me, for us." Samuel smiled, his eyes lingering on the structure before him. "It's not just the walls, William. It's the faith inside them. That's what will hold you steady when the storms come again." And as the two men looked out over the fields, the barn, and the new cabin rising before them, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together with faith, strength, and the knowledge that they had built something that would endure. Summer arrived quietly, carrying with it the promise of warmth and bounty. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the land. The once frozen fields had begun to stretch with new life, as crops were planted and the earth came alive once more. The Miller farm had flourished under Samuel's careful hands, and his neighbors had begun to see the changes as well. It had been a few weeks since the day Samuel and William Crawford had spent building the new cabin, and while the warmth of summer made the winter seem distant, the lessons from that season still hung in the air. Samuel's faith in preparation had proven true, and now, as the days stretched longer, he found himself visiting the neighboring farms, helping where he could. Word had spread throughout the small community. Samuel's cabin, the one that had withstood the harshest winter anyone could remember, had become a quiet symbol of resilience. And now, as he walked through the fields, he saw more than just the green sprouts of crops. He saw a shift in the community. People were beginning to think differently about the winter to come. They were beginning to build, not just for shelter, but for survival. That afternoon, as Samuel returned from a visit to a nearby farm, he noticed something different. Neighbors, once skeptical, had gathered near his barn. Crawford was there, of course, his new cabin standing proud in the distance, but now there were others. Men from the village, who had been silent spectators during the storm, were now rolling up their sleeves and making their way toward Samuel. "Samuel," said one of the men, Thomas Hale, a neighboring farmer, wiping the sweat from his brow, "we've come to learn. We know we're behind, but we want to do better. Will you help us?" Samuel looked out at the group of men, some with their wives and children standing just behind them. There was a quiet humility in the way they stood, ready to listen. He nodded, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. "I'll help you," Samuel said, his voice steady and calm. "But the first thing we need to do is build together. Not just walls, but trust. We'll make sure that no matter the winter, our families will be ready." The work began almost immediately. In the coming days, men and women alike showed up at Samuel's barn, bringing tools, wood, and a shared resolve to rebuild their community. They worked side by side, each knowing that the storms of tomorrow would be nothing compared to the strength they'd find in one another. The days passed quickly, each one filled with the steady hum of progress. By midsummer, the once quiet and skeptical community had transformed. The barn that had once stood alone now hosted gatherings of families working together. What began as a single lesson shared between Samuel and William Crawford had grown into something larger, a movement of shared responsibility, humility, and faith. Samuel stood outside his barn one warm evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The work had slowed for the day, but the sense of accomplishment remained. He had passed on the lessons his father had taught him, and now his neighbors were building stronger, more resilient homes for their families. Not just homes that could withstand the cold, but homes that could withstand the challenges of life itself. As Samuel gazed at the growing cabins, now adorned with thicker walls and stronger foundations, he saw something more than just physical structures. He saw the embodiment of community, of people who had once stood apart but were now united in purpose. And for the first time in many years, he felt at peace. The next winter would come, but Samuel knew that it would not come with the same fear and uncertainty. The preparation, the care, the faith, all of these would guide them through the storm. And in the heart of every cabin stood the legacy of Samuel's quiet, steadfast resolve. That winter, as the first snowflakes began to fall once more, Samuel walked through the village. He stopped at the new homes, the cabins built stronger, warmer, and filled with the strength of their families. Each home had a hidden room, a place of refuge. Each home had been built not just with wood and stone, but with the unspoken understanding that survival is not a solitary endeavor. Samuel smiled as he walked past the cabins. The storm was no longer something to fear. It was simply a reminder of what they had all built together. The land, the barns, the homes, and the lives, they were strong, not because of individual strength, but because of the faith and community that held them together. The storm had come and gone, but the legacy of their resilience would remain forever, passed down through generations. And in each new story shared around a warm hearth, Samuel's quiet lesson would live on. That when the storm comes, the greatest shelter is built not by hands alone, but by hearts that trust, work, and believe together.